All right, so it's my great pleasure to welcome virtually all the way from New York City, Bart Bonikowski. Bart Bonikowski is a professor of sociology at the Department of Sociology at NYU. Bart got his BA in sociology from Queen's University, not all the way too far from here, and then a PhD at Princeton, and then spent roughly a decade, I think, at Harvard University before moving on to NYU. Bart is, I think, one of the scholars who does the most exciting work on nationalism these days. So combining insights from cultural sociology to study political phenomena like nationalism. And today he's going to talk to us about a topic that's the 2016 election and how nationalism played into that. So given that the latest election is basically over, not for everybody yet, but like for, I think for at least the majority of the people in the United States think it's done, I think we can enjoy this talk with a relatively little anxiety. So that's, I think that's another added bonus. So thanks again for coming out here, and take it away, Bart.
Thanks so much, Thomas. I appreciate the invitation. It's wonderful to be in McGill always, and in Montreal as well. This time virtually, but nonetheless, I'm really happy to be here. Usually, as I mentioned earlier, I give a trigger warning when I put these faces up on the screen. Maybe the trigger warning is not as potent this time as before, but nonetheless, he's still with us for a few more weeks. So, make of it what you will, and we can talk about a little bit toward the end of the talk about the 2020 election and what might be happening going forward if that's of interest to you. But what I want to focus on today is trying to characterize and explain the rise of radical right politics in the US and Europe. That's sort of the theoretical first half of the talk, and the empirical second half will focus on a particular study that I've done in the United States that helps, I think, give some background, some context for the rise of Trumpism in 2015 and 16, and I think has some implications for what might happen going forward. So that'll be the plan. To start off, all of you know these characters. There's been a growing cast of characters on the radical right. This is a radical right is what I'll call it. It's a problematic concept in some ways, but it's as good as we have for now. So a growing cast of characters across European countries. New entrants into the political game. In some cases, older parties have been morphed into the radical right with more and more leaders becoming more mainstream, and in some cases assuming control of governments or entering into governing coalitions. So those are the characters from Europe. Of course, as everyone knows, we have here in the US our own homegrown radical right politician who captured the Republican Party a good 5 years ago. And the rise of this politics, its mainstreaming, I think raises three major puzzles for us. These are puzzles that many scholars working on this topic have been trying to come to terms with. The first one is, what is the radical right? And I'll talk about that a little bit, but I promise not to make it too didactic and too long. But I think it's important to figure out, to characterize the radical right appropriately, to know which aspects of it we should study and how. Second of all, why has it been surging in recent years? And by surging, I don't necessarily mean that it's sort of a linear wave, but it's become increasingly mainstream. The characters that I showed you at the beginning are kind of just part and parcel of mainstream politics these days. And third, something I won't get to in much detail, but we can talk about in the Q&A, what are the consequences of this form of politics going forward for democracy, both for the liberal side of liberal democracy and democracy side of liberal democracy. I think there's sort of distinct but related consequences for those institutions and social relations. So there are four main claims that I want to make today. First, that nationalism is essential for understanding the rise of the radical right. There are two other concepts that I'll discuss briefly: populism and authoritarianism, also important, but I really want to focus on nationalism as a central driver of the rise of this kind of politics. Second, I'm going to claim that nationalist cleavages, that is deep divisions and disagreements within national populations about what the nation means, have been latent in the US political culture for a long time, and they've become, and also latent, but also pretty stable over time, right? The US is not getting much more xenophobic or racist or ethno-nationalist over time, actually. But what has changed is that these latent cleavages recently have become manifest and politically salient. So they've been around for a long time, but people weren't always acting on them politically. And in recent years, they've started to do so. That's the argument. And finally, the reason for this activation of these latent cleavages, I want to argue, it's in part the fact that nationalism has become sorted by party in the last about 15 years or so, in a time when there are a lot of causes for a perception of generalized collective status threat among white majorities. So you've got the sorting of nationalism by party, just at the time when white majorities are feeling a threat to their collective status, which is an important combination of factors, I think, that explains the US case. But importantly, even though I'm going to be talking about the US case in particular, especially empirically, the theoretical model that I'll be describing applies across cases with obviously case-specific variation. And the model itself, the theoretical model, is kind of at the heart of the book I'm working on right now, which is titled Radicalized, and it's under contract with Princeton. So hopefully that'll be done sometime next year. So the plan for today, first, is to talk a little bit about what nationalism is, as I use the term, and how it relates to the radical right, to give you an overview of this theoretical model, kind of a broad theoretical model that helps explain or tries to explain why radical right politics is surging now, and where the current study fits in. Then we'll get to some of the empirical evidence, some hypotheses and results about nationalism as a predictor of the 2016 election, both the primaries and the general election, as well as longer term trends in the distribution of nationalist beliefs from 1996 to 2016. And I'll get into some of these. I'll get into why I'm asking these two questions in a little bit. And finally, if we get to it, maybe in the Q&A or maybe a little bit earlier, we'll talk about 2020 and what's been happening in the last few weeks and what might happen in the near future. So let me begin with the first puzzle. What is the radical right? There's a lot written about this, and I'm not going to review it all. But although there are many different concepts thrown around there for the rise of kind of extremist right-wing politics that combines a number of key features, the way I like to think about it is that it's really, you know, the umbrella term for that type of politics is the radical right. I'm following Kasmuda here, although he's recently shifted to far right. And there are three real main elements of this form of politics. And this is, again, consistent with Muda, but an argument I've been making for a while as well, that the three constitutive elements of radical right politics are populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism. I'll talk about nationalism for most of today's talk, but just very briefly, populism, as many of you know, it's a way of making political claims that juxtaposes some sort of a corrupt elite with the virtuous people, and often is quite skeptical of intermediary institutions, democratic institutions. The elites are fungible. They can be, you know, Wall Street fat cats when populism occurs on the left. They're typically bureaucrats and politicians when populism occurs on the right. So that's one important aspect of radical right politics, but we're going to bracket that. The third one here is authoritarianism, and that's really a way of governing, right? These are a set of governance tools that radical right politicians rely on once they're in power, typically. But they also signal them quite often in their electoral campaigns prior to entering office. And so this is, you know, as you very well know, a routine violation of democratic norms, the use of the law against particular groups. Basically, the two goals of authoritarian governance is to stay in power as long as possible and to represent the interest of the core base of the authoritarian regime. In the case of the radical right, it's often white majorities, typically non-urban white majorities in most of the contemporary democracies. So populism and authoritarianism are both really important, but they've gotten a lot of attention. I think what's gotten less attention is the third component, nationalism, and particularly ethno-nationalism, which I'll get to in a second. Often it's labeled nativism. Some people just talk about anti-immigrant attitudes, but I really want to theorize nationalism much more richly than that and place it at the center of our explanation for the rise of the radical right. So when I say nationalism, what I'm referring to for most part are conceptions of nationhood, how people understand their own nations. And I want to argue that, these conceptions of nationhood are multifaceted, multidimensional, and actually quite varied within countries. And so when I say multidimensional, they touch on a number of different aspects of nationhood. The first one, most obvious one perhaps, is what are the legitimate symbolic boundaries of the nation? Who gets to be a legitimate member, who does not? So for some, religion is an important aspect of national membership. For others, it's not. For some, language is crucial. For others, it's not. Race, ethnicity, and so on. Birth in the country, ancestry, for others, that doesn't matter. So that's one set of beliefs and attitudes, that make up people's conceptions of nationhood. But that's not all. There's also the relationship between the nation and the state. So for instance, should the state be something to be feared and weary of? or is the state something to be celebrated? What is the relation to the nation, between the nation and the state? And also, which aspect of the nation are people proud of, right? So this is kind of domain-specific national pride as part of this as well. And finally, another aspect of nationalism is how people understand the nation's role in the broader world. And so typically this is labeled chauvinism. Somebody is not chauvinistic or is strongly chauvinistic, but chauvinism itself has various components. So in this case, I'm just illustrating this with how people think about the role of the US military abroad. So on the left, the US military is a force of good, humanitarian aid. On the right, it's the policeman of the world. So that's one aspect of thinking about the nation vis-a-vis the rest of the world, but it's also about whether one thinks that one's country is the best in the world and everyone else should be like Americans or Canadians and so forth. And so what these pictures are trying to illustrate here, or what I'm trying to illustrate with these pictures, is that how we understand what America means or what Canada means is composed of these various attitudes and beliefs that cohere together. And when I say cohere together, if you take these pictures as indicative of attitudes, I mean that they actually compose these relational cognitive cultural structures, right? So we can think of these two relational networks I just put up on the screen as illustrative of two different people, or maybe two different groups within the country. So, and these are obviously toy examples. So on the left here, you've got somebody who thinks that race is irrelevant, religion is irrelevant, and language is irrelevant for national membership, that the state should be celebrated, and that the US military is a force of good. On the right, you've got somebody else who thinks quite differently about what America means. Here, religion is an important aspect of nationhood, as is language, and the state should be critiqued and feared and held at bay, while the US military is sort of seen as a policeman of the world. And the reason why it's important to think of these configurations as relational is that I want to argue that what one of these beliefs means depends on what the others are. So in a nutshell, if somebody tells you, I think English is a crucial prerequisite, speaking English is a crucial prerequisite for being an American, you don't actually know what that means, right? On one hand, this person could be an ethno-nationalist, racist, xenophobe, etc. On the other hand, this person might just have a kind of a civic Republican conception of nationhood. That is, yes, you need English because that's an important skill to have in order to participate in the politics and the economy of the country fully. And so to know which of these two belief structures this one survey response, let's say about speaking English, corresponds to, you need to know the other survey responses as well, the other beliefs that constitute somebody's kind of cultural network, cognitive network. So if that person also tells you, you have to be white and you have to also be Christian, that's much more likely to be an ethno-nationalist conception than if somebody says, well, no, I don't care about anything else. As long as they speak English, that's all that matters. The rest is just kind of subjective, affiliation with the nation, and that's that, respect for the laws maybe. In which case, you would recognize that person to be a civic Republican. So the point here is that what any of these beliefs, any of these conceptions that you see here indicated with these pictures means depends on what other ones are associated with it in this kind of relational framework. So if you're still with me on that, then the task becomes to identify these configurations of beliefs. And we can do so in a variety of ways. We can do so in survey data. We can do so in political speeches on the supply side of politics. And we can start identifying different configurations of beliefs, different types of nationalism, if you will. And so I've done that in the past in my own work. And Thomas has actually done so in his own work as well. And what I found in the past is that there's quite a lot of within country heterogeneity in people's conceptions of nationhood. And actually a lot of between country similarity in the kind of menu of options for how one can understand the nation. And so this bears some resemblance to the work of Roger Smith on civic ideals, his book where he traced different conceptions of America through the course of 200 years of the law. And so this is something quite similar. It's the same kind of idea that there are different Americas out there, different conceptions of America. But in my case, I'm particularly interested in identifying them in survey data, in the belief structures of everyday Americans, as well as in the claims that politicians make. And I've seen, in past research, I've seen that these belief structures, these different conceptions of nationhood, cohere into four types. I'll call them for now liberal, restrictive, ardent, and disengaged. In the US, sometimes they're called liberal creedal. It's sort of the US version of liberal nationalism is creedal nationalism. I'll get into what the meaning of these four types in a little bit, but all I just want to convince you of for now is that these four types of nationalism are very robust to different types of data, different model specifications, and in fact, they're found across most contemporary democracies. So I've tried to do everything I can to make them go away, and I keep finding them over and over and over again. They're patterned, they're stable, they are correlated systematically with sociodemographic predictors. They're also correlated with downstream political attitudes. And I've tried to argue that these are essentially these latent cleavages, cultural cleavages in the population that for most part are not politically active, at least not not dominant in their influence in politics. But once in a while, they can be activated and mobilized at particular moments in history by opportunistic political elites. And I would argue that the recent years that we've seen in the United States and elsewhere are exactly this kind of circumstance where these latent cleavages have been politically mobilized, have become potent, and have driven people's political behavior. Now, interestingly, in the early 2000s, in a paper that I wrote, published in 2016 with Paul DiMaggio, we showed that as of the early 2000s in the US, these types of nationalism cut across ideology, they cut across party, and cut across race to some degree. So that but the party idea is the thing I want to really focus on. You couldn't predict if someone is a Democrat or a Republican based on their nationalist beliefs. This is in the early 2000s. And conversely, you couldn't predict somebody's nationalist beliefs if you knew their party ID. And so it becomes an interesting question whether that's still the case today, whether that was still the case in 2016. And no one, at least to my knowledge, has looked at the impact of these nationalist beliefs on voting preferences. And so that's one of the main objectives of the empirical study I'm going to show you in a minute. So that's what the radical right is, right? Populism, nationalism, and authoritarianism, in my conception of it. All three of these components exist in people's beliefs on the demand side. They also exist in political claims on the supply side. And I really want to focus on nationalism as the central component. Now, the question is, why has radical right politics been surging? And so I've already hinted at some of the reasons, but let me lay out a slightly more coherent narrative of why that might be the case. So in a nutshell, I would argue that these nationalist cleavages, latent nationalist cleavages that I've described, are the fuel for the rise of radical right politics. Anti-elitism and low institutional trust, which are often evoked by populist claims, stoke the fire of nationalism. And then the result is greater tolerance in public for authoritarian rule, for authoritarian norm violations. And so that's that's basically the theory, but I'll get into some more detail. What's interesting is that none of these things are new, right? So nationalism has been around for a long time on the claim side, on the supply side. So is populism, so is authoritarianism. Similarly, the beliefs, populist nationalist beliefs, sort of tolerance for authoritarianism, institutional trust, these haven't changed radically in the last 20, 30 years. In fact, except for trust in institutions, which has declined, although not to an unprecedented level, most of the other attitudes are pretty stable in the aggregate, which then raises a puzzle. How can you explain change, the rise of radical politics, with otherwise stable predictors? So what I want to argue is that what has made these pre-existing frames and pre-existing attitudes all of a sudden resonate anew are a set of structural changes, cultural, social, political, economic changes that have essentially allowed elites, opportunistic elites, to mobilize these pre-existing nationalist cleavages in new ways. And these changes some of them are real, but many of them are perceived, and there's certainly, the fears around them are drummed up by media elites and by politicians. So which changes? You can probably imagine some of them. They're certainly economic. Economic crises are among these changes, but also longer term shifts like the deindustrialization, the offshoring of jobs. And so there's a whole literature that talks about economic predictors of radical right preference and voting. But that's not all. And what I want to stress is that the economic factors cannot be distinguished from cultural factors. These are not two competing explanations. These economic changes, real and perceived, individual and sociotropic, are filtered through cultural conceptions and people's cultural understandings of themselves and their groups and their relation to other groups. So economic changes are among them, but also demographic changes, immigration. In Europe, the refugee crisis, something that was quite real. In the United States, fear of immigration, which is less real in the sense that immigration numbers and rates have been dropping in the US for a long time, but the fear has not. It's also about national security shocks, about terrorist attacks, which are then interpreted in particular ways and often conflated with immigration in potent ways, I would say. It's also about particular policies, like in the US, affirmative action, which are, on the face of it, may seem kind of distinct from the other things I've been describing, but they're similar in their effects. That is, the same population that gets terrified of immigration often gets terrified of affirmative action. And the reason for that is that they think that this is a kind of a bending of the rules for some groups that disadvantages other groups. That's the narrative. It's also about changes to popular culture. So at some point in the United States, white working class or lower middle class Americans were seen as the heart of the nation. Middle America was sort of seen as the heart of the nation. And that's changed over time. Now, I'm not arguing that Hollywood and the entertainment business have become totally diverse or anything like that. There's tons of inequality, and white actors and white entertainers continue to dominate. But there is a perceived shift toward more multicultural, diverse forms of entertainment and popular culture, where who is at the center core of the nation has shifted to some degree. It's also about movements, right? In the United States, it's about movements for racial justice, the Black Lives Matter movement. This is another set of changes and that creates the same kind of effect. And that effect was really heightened during Barack Obama's presidency, which, the beginning with the birther movement all the way through the presidency, there were strong attempts made to delegitimize Obama, but also the presidency itself. And this was another kind of idiosyncratic change in the United States, but one that layered on top of all the other changes I just mentioned. What happens with all of these different perceived and real changes is that they end up creating a sense of collective status threat among white majorities. Now, importantly, if you think across countries, which ones of these shocks and transformations are most important varies a lot. There was no Obama in the Netherlands, right? Similarly, the economic factors are more important in certain countries than others. So in Eastern European countries, economic shocks were much more muted than they were elsewhere. So I really want to argue for a multi-causal understanding of where this stuff comes from. You have a whole wide range of potential causes of a sense of collective status threat, and which of those causes is important varies across countries in an important way. And also, there are a lot of these idiosyncratic moments, like Obama's election in the US, or the downing of a plane full of government officials in Poland, the Smolensk catastrophe, right, which continues to be politically potent. So there are these idiosyncratic case-specific moments as well. But they all add up to a similar consequence. And so the theoretical model as a whole is roughly like this. If you think of the top of the slide as the supply side of politics, that is the claims that are made by politicians and their media supporters. And then on the bottom side of the slide, you've got the demand side, beliefs and preferences and attitudes in the public. You have nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism on both sides, in terms of the claims and in terms of the beliefs. And over time, for most part, there is little happening in the aggregate. The claims have been around for a long time. The attitudes are pretty stable. But if you look a little deeper underneath the aggregate level, you start seeing actually some changes, right? So on the supply side, yes, nationalist, populist, and authoritarian frames have been around for a long time, but they've been increasingly recombined creatively into kind of this winning discursive formula, where nationalism, populism, and authoritarianism are brought together to reinforce one another and their sort of elective affinities between them in a way that makes them very powerful. There's also been a fusion of these beliefs. I have this other paper under review right now, experimentally showing that if you prime Americans with just populism, just anti-elite language, you end up getting greater antipathy towards minorities among Republicans and especially Trump supporters. So populism has become a dog whistle for nationalism. They've become fused discursively and cognitively. On the demand side, you've got aggregate stability in these attitudes, but there's a lot happening underneath, right? So there is this potential for partisan sorting of beliefs. So maybe Americans are not becoming more xenophobic or racist in the aggregate, but the two parties are drifting apart on these issues, and I want to argue and show you in a minute. There's also been the erosion of other important collective identities, like labor identities, with the demise of unions, labor unions in the US, starting in the early 80s, going forward. The importance of labor identity for making people feel a sense of collective self-worth has eroded, and I want to argue nationalism has filled in that void. So that's what's happening with attitudes and the claims. And then you've got these changes that I've been talking about, these cultural structural changes that create a sense of fear and anxiety. And that fear and anxiety is then channeled toward outgroup resentment by elites. So you're scared of terrorism, you're scared of immigration, you're scared of your jobs disappearing, blame those people over there, right? And that typically is immigrants, it can be Muslim minorities, it can be a whole slew of different outgroups, and that varies across cases. But when you have this kind of set of fears and anxieties that are turned into resentments, over time, the white majorities develop a perceived sense of collective status threat, either because of their own experience or their kind of mediated sociotropic concerns. So maybe I'm not losing my job, maybe I'm not threatened, but my cousin is, or some other person out there who I heard about in the media who's like me, And of course, like me, you can fill in with racial, religious, and other categories. And so once you have these three elements, right? The supply side claims, the demand side beliefs, and these changes and shocks that have activated collective status threat, then all of a sudden you've got the mobilization of nationalist cleavages, I want to argue. So pre-existing claims and pre-existing beliefs that hadn't resonated before now resonate anew. And when that happens, the consequence of that is increased success of the radical right. Not always sweeping successes in the US over the last 4 years, but often an increased prevalence in parliament, sometimes joining coalitions, governing coalitions, sometimes leading government. And interestingly, this is the last piece, once this works in one place, it is often duplicated elsewhere. That is, political elites realize that these claims, these combinations of claims have worked in country A, so they adopt it to their local setting. And they create the same kind of fears and anxieties that then activate these nationalist cleavages and lead to radical right success in their case. And very often, this borrowing happens regardless of ideology. People copy each other across countries, even though they fundamentally disagree about ideology. So something we can talk about more. Now, in the remaining time that I have, which is short, I'm going to focus just on one piece of this empirically. Nationalist cleavages, their sorting over time, and how they influenced voting in 2016, with some of the other stuff kind of in the background. So the empirical strategy is to use repeated cross-section of data from 1996 all the way through 2016, and use a method called latent class analysis to identify these clusters of nationalist beliefs. And then generate some hypotheses about what beliefs should go with which candidate in the primaries and in the general election in 2016, based on the speeches and the claims that were being made by the campaigns. So we're going to predict 2016 votes using a survey that I conducted the weekend before the 2016 election, as well as retrospective voting in the primary at that time. And then we're going to look at how these nationalist beliefs shifted over time against the backdrop of aggregate stability, presumably. The survey data come from a few different surveys. There are 3 waves of the GSS, 2 waves of the GSS, specifically the ISSP National Identity Supplement, and then 2 surveys that I conducted, one with GFK and one with YouGov. The YouGov one, as I mentioned, happened right before the election in 2016, and I actually just collected a re-interview before this election. And then there are 23 nationalist attitude items. They are pretty standard in literature, but they span national attachment, how close you feel to the nation, what aspects of nationhood are important for national belonging, so language, religion, ancestry, birth in the country, etc. Domain-specific pride, how proud are you of the nation's accomplishments in the arts or in economic accomplishments or the nation's democracy and so forth. And chauvinism, whether you think your country is the best in the world, along a variety of dimensions. And what I do is I take these 23 items and I create a latent class analysis, a latent class model. Latent class analysis essentially allows me to identify patterns of responses that are similar across respondents. So this is roughly how it works. Imagine you've got this data set, respondents in the rows, variables in the columns. What latent class analysis allows you to do is say, hey, look, respondents A, C, and F responded to 5 questions in the same way. And if these questions are Likert scale nationalism items, on variables 1 and 2, these 3 respondents had a very low score. On variable 3, moderate and high score, and so forth. And then same B, D, and E have a different profile of responses, and G is an isolate. And latent class analysis then groups these respondents into groups, into these kind of groups of similarly, of respondents with similar response profiles. Now, if we think that's, there are a few assumptions. As long as we think that survey answers are indicative of something, and that these questions are reasonable, then this should tell us that these 3 groups that I've shown you here think about the nation in 3 different ways. And so that's precisely what we do. We administer latent class analysis to these 5,000 observations across these 5 survey waves, and we generate 4 latent classes. Why 4? We can talk about later, but 4 seems to be the magic number. And I call them creedal or liberal nationalists, restrictive nationalists, ardent, and disengaged. This is what they mean, but that's more than you can chew on right now. So I'm just going to simplify this. So I'm going to describe them very briefly. So the creedal nationalists are moderate in attachment, have a civic conception of national boundaries, kind of elective criteria matter, ascriptive criteria don't. High levels of pride and moderate chauvinism. These are sort of mainstream creedal liberal nationalists, kind of mainstream American nationalists. Open-minded, but proud and somewhat chauvinistic. Restrictive nationalists are high in attachment, have an exclusionary ethnic conception of national boundaries, but very low levels of national pride, especially in state institutions, and moderate chauvinism. Ardent nationalists are high across the board. These are like American jingoistic nationalists, right? High attachment, ethno-religious boundaries, high pride, high chauvinism. And the disengaged are low across the board. Moderate attachment, open-minded, kind of inclusive boundaries, low levels of pride, and low levels of chauvinism. The main takeaway here is that this is not a monotonic distribution. This is not from least nationalist to most nationalist. These are cross-cutting categories, right? So there's some things that creedals share with the ardent nationalists, like high pride, and there are other things that creedal nationalists share with the disengaged, like civic national boundaries, right? So it's not from most to least nationalist or vice versa. It's rather different configurations. But it is the case that restrictive nationalists and ardent nationalists are more exclusionary. But then their pride is quite different, right? And you see that they have some in common. Ardents have something in common with creedals. Restrictive has something in common with disengaged. Okay. So do these beliefs predict voting in 2016, and how did they change over time? Well, we have hints from the campaigns, pretty strong hints, what they were arguing, right? So we know Trump's wall, Clinton's much more inclusive, kind of America as a nation of immigrants. So we have some hints about what should, which responses, which kind of belief should go with which candidate. But we also run some text analysis on the full corpus of speeches from that election to get a even stronger kind of intuitions about what belongs where. And so this is using a word embedding algorithm. Basically, the closer these terms are to one another, the more similar they're in meaning for a given candidate. So in this case, these are the terms for Trump that were associated with dangerous. Okay, refugees, radical, cartels, gangs, violent, criminals, turmoil, gays, aliens, visas, pouring over borders, right? Ethno-nationalist, exclusionary, combining, mixing up immigration, national security, crime, etc. Not very surprising, knowing his campaign. Here are the terms that are close to politics for him: failed, failures, arrogant, entrenched, elitism, squandered, cynicism, establishment, corrupt, bitter, right? So this is kind of the populist side. America's going to hell in a handbasket because immigrants are taking over, and liberal elites in government are a failed establishment, corrupt establishment. I'm here to help, right? So this is the kind of ethno-nationalism, but also combined with a pretty dismal view of America. So it's not just about exclusion, it's also about those pride variables that we talked about. For Clinton, what's dangerous is very different. What's dangerous is partisanship, extremism, Russia, violence and bullying, right? And for Clinton, politics is about inclusiveness, respect, unifying, participating, prosperity, growth, contribution. To the degree that she's got negative terms here, they're typically, she used them to slander Trump and sort of critique him. And we did something similar for Sanders. He was kind of, his campaign did not engage in nationalism in any kind of concerted way. But, these are not particularly interesting results. But when you look at politics, it's actually kind of similar to Trump. So the establishment is corrupted, right? It's bought, it's billionaires, and so forth, right? So it's an economic kind of populism, but also low on national pride in the sense that the nation is in trouble and we need to save it. So I flagged that because it's going to become important in a minute. And Republicans, moderate Republican candidates were actually quite similar to Clinton on these two axes. So the hypotheses are that the exclusionary types of nationalism should be associated with Trump support over Clinton. Inclusive nationalism should be associated with Clinton over Trump. And then Trump versus moderates should be similar to Trump versus Clinton. The more inclusive types of nationalism, that is, should be associated with moderates, whereas the exclusionary ones like restrictive and ardent nationalism should be associated with Trump support in the primary. Trump versus Cruz, we didn't have strong predictions because Cruz became Trump-like over the course of the campaign, so there shouldn't be too many differences. And then Clinton versus Sanders, here it's not the inclusion-exclusion that matters so much, but this kind of populism, right? This level of pride that's evoked. And so we thought, well, this suggests that maybe those who are disengaged from the nation, like one, they have an arm's length relationship to the nation, should be more likely to support Sanders over Clinton in the primary. And then two longitudinal hypotheses, and I'm almost done. The first is this, a lot of people talked about in the media and even in scholarship, that Trump created and rode a wave of nativism prior to 2016. So that's one possibility, that we're going to see an uptick in these kind of restrictive and ardent forms of nationalism right before the election. Or it may be the case that actually not much happened right before 2016. Instead, there's been a longer term change in how the two parties understand America and how their partisans understand America. So that's the partisan sorting hypothesis. So first, let's look at the vote prediction. So this is these are predicted probability, or the marginal effects, average marginal effects of nationalist beliefs on Trump support. So if the coefficients to the right, if the AME is to the right, suggest that it's associated with Trump support over Clinton. And there are three models here. The first one has nationalism alone. The second one introduces sociodemographic covariates controls, and the last one controls for party ID. Now, as all of you political scientists know, party ID in the United States is the strongest predictor of any kind of voting. So in some ways, the primaries are even more interesting than the general. In the general, Republicans vote Republican, Democrats vote Democrat. So we shouldn't see much happening once we control for party ID, and yet we do. So basically, the pattern is such that those who had exclusionary conceptions of nationhood, the ardent and restrictive nationalists, were consistently more likely to support Trump over Clinton in the general. And the disengaged, who were actually inclusive in their conceptions of America, but had low levels of pride, also went for Trump over Clinton in 2016. So this is consistent, and even when we control for party ID, this effect for most part remains, or this pattern remains. Skip that. Now, Trump versus moderates, a similar pattern, although you don't have the same kind of effect for the disengaged. It's really about exclusion and inclusion. Ardent and restrictive nationalists were more likely to vote Trump versus moderates in the primary, in the Republican primary, as opposed to creedal nationalists, and the others have no significant differences. So a similar pattern to Trump versus Clinton. Trump versus Cruz, small sample, so I don't want to make too much of this, but no clear pattern. Nationalism did not predict one versus the other in any significant way. And finally, Clinton versus Sanders, quite clearly, disengagement from the nation was associated with strong support for Sanders over Clinton. So if you were exclusionary, even if you were ardent or restrictive, so at the nationalist conceptions of nationhood, low or high pride, you were more likely to go for Clinton over Sanders, interestingly. So basically, disengagement was a consistent predictor of Sanders support across the board. So if you didn't care much for nationalism and you were had pretty low levels of pride in America, Sanders was your candidate in the Democratic primary. Finally, what happened over time? So this is the aggregate. There is stuff happening here, but and it's particularly happening after 9/11, right? So 2004, this wave of data, there was a pretty big upwelling of restrictive nationalism. But if you look at what happened, the distribution in 1996 and distribution in 2016 of these four types of nationalism, it's not as different as one would imagine, right? Creedal nationalism is pretty much the same. Ardent nationalism is pretty much the same. Disengagement is pretty much the same. Restrictive nationalism goes up somewhat. But once you disaggregate by party, a lot more action is visible. So this is how Democrats looked. In 1996, the four types of nationalism were more or less equally present among Democrats, right? So you've got restrictive nationalism and creedal nationalism, both pretty much on par, and then disengaged and ardent pretty much on par. By 2016, Democrats are overwhelmingly creedal nationalists, and the rest are a small portion of the partisans. And if you focus on the two types of nationalism that had the most change among Democrats, look what happens to creedals and restrictives. Basically, a huge shift toward creedal nationalism over the course of that 20 years, and a dissipation of restrictive nationalism among Democrats. If you look at Republicans, something a little bit different is happening. So I'm going to just focus on the two biggest changes. Creedal nationalism goes down from almost 40% down to about 20%, so half, less, more than halves. And then restrictive nationalism skyrockets among Republicans from about, close to 30% to about 50%. So that's a big change over the course of 20 years. And if you look at strong partisans, the same pattern is even more pronounced. This summarizes it basically. This is predicting that you're a Republican versus Democrat based on your nationalist beliefs. If you look at creedal nationalists, the probability that a creedal nationalist is a Republican goes down quite a bit, and probability that you're a Republican if you're restrictive goes up significantly, and not much happening with the other two. So what we've essentially observed is the sorting of two of these types of nationalism into the two parties. So the argument basically has been, and this empirical study, and then I'm done, that nationalist cleavages were central to 2016, both in the primary and the general election. You saw the patterns, I'm not going to repeat them. And that in the aggregate, nationalism is either stable, maybe becoming a little more inclusive overall, but there's consistent and strong evidence of partisan sorting, which I think was catalyzed partly by 9/11. Republicans kind of peaked and then never came back down, whereas Democrats became more exclusionary, but then reversed to the mean and then continued becoming more inclusive over time. And this is, for me, evidence of growing demand among Republicans for Trump-like politics, for radical right politics. That demand has been there for a long time. This is why we saw the Tea Party. This is why we saw Palin. But it was only Trump who was able to capture that demand in such a skillful way. I hate to say skillful with regards to Trump, but he was good at this one thing, that is activating these nationalist beliefs and making them count at the polls. In 2020 to some degree as well, of course. So what are the implications for 2020? I'm going to stop here. If you want to talk about this, we can. And I'll just come back to that. But for now, I just want to say thank you, and I look forward to the questions.
Well, thank you, Bart, for this fascinating, interesting presentation. What is the, sorry, how do we do the questions? Do people just raise their hands and then Bart, you can call on them, or I can help out with moderating them as we prefer?
See, maybe if you could moderate, that'd be helpful, and I'll just grab it.
So I'll moderate. So you can either raise your hand or type something in the chat box, and I will call on you. I see Henry Milner.
I thought somebody should start, so that's always worth trying. Now it's wonderful. I mean, I think you've put it all together, and I look forward to our discussion of 2020. Now, as I understand, this is not, the data is, what's the word? I'm missing the word, but these are different people being tested in these various periods. Now, so it seems to me that part of it, the sorting, is going in the other direction. That is that people of certain views are moving to the Republican Party, and people of certain other views are moving toward the Democrats. So it's not just simply that the parties have moved, it's that people have moved into the parties. And how do you separate those two factors? The second point I would want to make is a much more general point, which if we get into the comparative stuff, it does seem to me that, and this goes back many years, but one of the, that to some extent at least, multinational countries are somewhat immune to some of these factors that you're describing. That Canada, for example, or Belgium and so on, would have a harder time associating nationalism with populism and authoritarianism and so on, because you have a kind of bi or multicultural reality that doesn't quite fit. So those are the 2 points that I would raise.
Terrific points. Thank you very much, Henry. So both spot on. So in terms of the first question, the sorting could be due to people switching between parties or people switching their views within parties. And without longitudinal data, it's impossible to tell. So these are all repeated cross sections, as you point out, and I just don't know. So the best I can do are to sort of think about what the literature tells us. And there are unfortunately contradictory implications from a lot of the work. So if you think about, Aiken and Bartels would say that party identity is fundamentally important and the rest follows, right? And so the parties, as parties shift their policy preferences, people follow to the degree they even care about policy preferences, because what matters is their partisanship as a sense of collective kind of cohesion and identification. I think that's probably true to some degree. But on the other hand, nationalist beliefs are pretty deep beliefs. This is not just whether you support, some minimum wage or something, right? This is about what you think the nation means. So you would think they're a little more robust than that. And so if I were to sort of punt it, I would say probably both. Probably some people are switching parties. I mean, never Trumpers. Some of them have left the Republican Party, and certainly we've seen to some degree in the recent years the exit of African Americans and Latinos from the Republican Party, although it's not as dramatic as some people suggested it is. But also the potential for some shifts in these nationalist beliefs across time within individuals in response to party cues. So I mentioned that I have this 2020 re-interview data from the 2016 election That the reason I collected that is because this is the question that comes up very, very frequently. And unfortunately, there just aren't any good longitudinal data on nationalism out there. Just nobody cares enough about the topic, or had cared enough about the topic at some point, to collect those longitudinal data. So with this re-interview, I've got about 400 people who were interviewed the weekend before 2016 and the weekend before the 2020 election. And I'll be able to, I have a lot of data on their nationalist beliefs, and I'll be able to answer that question, hopefully, fingers crossed. Although, 400 people, by the time you start slicing them up by these latent classes and everything else and party, it gets tricky, but we'll see. The second question, so I do think you're right, the multinational countries are a little more complicated in the sense that there are other kinds of political tensions that are important, right? So these are regional cultural tensions, political tensions between, say, Quebec and Ottawa, right? Or between, Catalonia and Madrid, and so forth. And in many of those cases, those distinct axes of these distinct political cleavages have been sort of responsible for most political changes over time, rather than the kinds of radical right predictors that I'm talking about. And in fact, in a lot of those countries, especially in Europe, the minorities with separatist aspirations are very cosmopolitan and open-minded, because they're appealing to the EU, actually, often for their rights against the federal state. But I wouldn't go so far as to say that inoculates them from the dangers of radical right politics and the kinds of phenomena that I mentioned. So, in Belgium, Vlaams Belang has been quite active for a long time, and the arguments there are very similar. They're against immigrants. They're against Muslim immigrants in particular. They're sort of often civilizational arguments about the importance of progressive liberal rights, with which Muslims are incompatible. I've written a little bit about that. And then in Canada, I continue being very happy that Canada is a negative case when it comes to the radical right politics, but there have been local and provincial examples of this, right? So if you think about Ford, well, the previous Ford more than the current Ford, he certainly was, certainly populist and played around with some ethno-nationalist motifs as well. Doug less so. But there are these moments and these examples of at the provincial level. In Quebec, there's some strong nationalist currents, not just Quebec nationalists, but ethno-nationalists too, anti-immigrant currents as well. But you're right, they have obviously not made it into federal politics in the same kind of way as they have elsewhere, and may that remain to be the case. Just recently, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that finally another negative case ceased to be a negative case. So it used to be the case a long time ago that students would write dissertations about Sweden. Sweden does not have radical right politics and never will. And then 2-3 years later, it did. Portugal was a negative case for a long time. And now in the Azores, we're seeing the rise of radical right politics that is likely to be important for the country's federal politics in general, or domestic politics in general. So, a lot of these negative cases cease to be negative cases eventually. I hope that doesn't happen to Canada. Maybe that multinational status and multicultural status of Canada somehow will prevent that from happening. Here's hoping.
Matt, I have a question. Why don't you unmute yourself and then ask?
Well, thanks very much, Bart. That was a very interesting talk. I learned a lot. What I was most interested in is sort of getting at sort of the causes of sort of, you're showing these trends, and you mentioned things like economic problems as well as 9/11 as being sort of major issues promoting sort of this more sort of exclusionary nationalism for Republicans, and more inclusive with the Democrats. But I was wondering, how you're able to look into that with your data, and then, what you thought of somebody like Sunstein, for example, who brings up the issue of social media playing a role in sort of polarization and promoting different views, and thereby helping to promote that. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a great questions, man. So social media and then predictors are quiet. So one thing to say about, I want to make an argument with the comparative angle of this. So I think that's one way to make sense of which factors matter. And so those people who say it's all about the economy, that explanation starts being problematic when you look at some countries that didn't have economic crises prior to the rise of radical politics, so Eastern Europe, Poland, Hungary. If it's all about immigration, then how do we explain similarly those cases like Poland or Hungary, especially Poland, where there was no major influx of immigrants? If it's all about, Obama, obviously that's an idiosyncratic argument that only works in the United States and not elsewhere. And so, and also the kinds of outgroups that are vilified vary quite a bit. So in the book I'm writing, I'm trying to come up with sort of 4 examples toward the latter half of cases that are salient for seeing the different ways in which the same kinds of mechanisms play out. So in the US, the danger is seen as coming from immigrants, Mexican immigrants, from Muslims to some degree, but less so, but still, that's part of the discourse. In Western Europe, it's really about Muslim immigrants. Although what's interesting there is that even civic nationalism, this inclusive nationalism, has been turned against Muslims. So from Pim Fortuyn onward in the Netherlands, but also elsewhere, there's a clear evidence that people who think that gay rights and women's rights are important are being mobilized to think that Muslims are incompatible with that kind of a rights regime and therefore should be excluded. So now it's inclusive motivations for excluding Muslims. It's quite amazing. I've got a paper that shows that civic nationalism in population is quite strongly associated with anti-Muslim attitudes in Western Europe, but not elsewhere. In Eastern Europe, in Poland and elsewhere, it's Islamophobia without Muslims and anti-Semitism without Jews, right? It's a phantom fear. There are barely any Jews left in Poland, and there's certainly very few Muslims, but yet those 2 groups continue to be vilified profitably by nationalist elites because they might come back, or they may be steering things behind the scenes, or refugees who are arriving in Southern Europe, we're next, right? So this kind of phantom fear. And then if you look at the UK with Brexit, it was really not about Muslim immigrants, at least at first. It was really about Polish immigrants and Eastern European immigrants, intra-EU migration. That was kind of the salient outgroup. And so I think the argument I was trying to make there is that the vilified groups vary quite a bit across cases. Which of the changes and shocks is most relevant varies a lot across countries. But what we keep seeing is a very similar profile of voters in all of these places voting for very similar kinds of parties. And so it can be any one of those shocks that it's sort of definitively predicting it. It's rather, I'm trying to argue is the same mechanism. That mechanism is the creation of a sense of collective status threat to people who used to think that they are at the heart of the nation, and that activates these nationalist beliefs. And so you asked what kind of evidence I have for that. Well, it's always indirect, unfortunately, but the same kinds of nationalist cleavages I've seen in other places, and they seem to be associated with support for the radical right across these countries, even though it takes on different content in each case, which is quite interesting. And on social media and Sunstein, so social media is tough because it's very difficult to know how to study this. The people who study social media effects in a very rigorous way have so far seen much more muted effects than what we would imagine. So echo chambers are not nearly as tightly sealed and as strong as people assume. Empirically, it appears. People's media diets are far more varied than we think. And people also just don't care about politics as much as we think. So they're watching other stuff, right? But nonetheless, there have been studies that have shown that kind of the more or less randomized rollout of Fox News across the country did have an impact on voting for more conservative Republicans. And we do see evidence of algorithmic effects to some degree, YouTube kind of driving people toward more radical content, and the Facebook algorithm being also designed in a way that creates an audience for sensational news. So there is something going on. I think what's been really hard is to identify kind of the aggregate consequences of that for democracy. And so I think it's hard for anyone to believe that there is no impact, given that truth has become much more flexible than it used to be. That it's very hard to. The conspiracy theories are kind of proliferating. So I think there is some effect. I just don't know if that's the answer. It's probably a contributing factor, an exacerbating factor, more than anything else. The other thing I just want to mention, since I'm talking about conspiracy theories, there's some really interesting work by Oliver Hahn, Min-Jae Kim, and Ezra Zuckerman. The paper is titled The Authentic Appeal of the Lying Demagogue. And they show that Trump's lies, they actually use a slightly different design, but the implication is that Trump's lies are common knowledge lies. His supporters know he's lying. It's not that they're being duped. It's not that they believe in the conspiracies for most part. They know he's lying and they love it because him lying shows that he represents them and is, sticking it to the man, essentially, and is kind of it's scorched earth politics. And so that's really tough because all of a sudden fact checking has no bearing on it. People already know the truth. They just don't care because they love the lies. Now, now we're seeing with the current post-election climate, I think there's a much broader conspiracy theory about the election than that, but we'll see how lasting those statistics are. So I think social media do play a role together with a kind of a somewhat fragmented media landscape, and kind of the same message being repeated over and over and over again. We just don't know exactly what that, what the coefficient of that is, if you will.
Thank you. I have Andre has a question, and then Axel next.
Hello, thank you very much for the fascinating topic and talk. I have two questions. So firstly, do you separate the radical kind of populist right and the far right? Because on the picture, initially you had kind of both. You had the Golden Dawn, which I would argue is a bit more similar to Jobbik in Hungary, and yet you had Fidesz there. Mm-hmm. So how, do you separate the two? And connected to it is the question, do you think that the radical right is trying to use elements of credo or ardent nationalism in order to conceal the less acceptable restrictive nationalism? So Trump, for instance, really tries to appear as if he is a civic nationalist, right?
Yep.
Especially to his supporters, to appear more acceptable and non-threatening. So that's the first question. And the second question, if you could have a look at the link in the chat. Do you look at all at the gap between the views of elites and the electorate? And in particular, do you think that the thesis of Daniel Ziblatt that unwilling conservative elites who have a different version of nationalism from the electorate play a big role in hampering what would be a very natural alliance between nationalist leaders and nationalist supporters? So there are very few Mitt Romney type voters, and yet those people play a role in preventing the party from going radical right. So those are the two questions.
Great. Yep. So, yes, you're absolutely right about that I showed Golden Dawn and Fidesz in the front, and you can make the distinction between extreme right and radical right. I don't make that distinction myself in my work because I'm interested kind of in a broad rise of that kind of politics, and often there are strong interactions between the extreme right, far right, and radical right. But nonetheless, it's important. You're absolutely right. It's important to make those distinctions, and a number of people have. There's a great paper by Matthias Rodown in which he kind of looks at that kind of Venn diagram of the extreme right, the radical right, and then centrist parties, and same on the left. So I should make those distinctions probably a little more clear. The truth is, though, that a lot of the parties there's a lot of change over time, right? So Fidesz wasn't always a radical right party, right? And PiS in Poland wasn't always a radical right party either. So there's kind of morphing, partly in response to the far extreme right, in sort of trying to co-opt some of their voters, that some of these parties that had been more center-right have drifted toward further to the extreme and have become the radical right. But it's a good point. Whether the radical right uses creedal nationalism, yeah, absolutely. So the paper I was describing to you that I had written with Christina Simonsen, who's at Aarhus in Denmark, we looked at how civic nationalism on the demand side plays out across countries with respect to anti-Muslim views. And civic nationalism was associated with more inclusive attitudes toward Muslims in all countries, except Western Europe and Northern Europe. And in Western Europe and Northern Europe, civic nationalist beliefs were associated with strong anti-Muslim sentiments, precisely because of what you were just describing, precisely because radical right elites, since Pim Fortuyn, through Geert Wilders, but also Le Pen and others, have dressed up and kind of dressed up their exclusionary claims in this language of civilizational rights regimes. So if you care about European civilization and all of the achievements it's made, including gay rights and women's rights, we should get rid of Muslims because they're fundamentally and incompatible with that kind of European culture, right? So it's an amazing argument because it uses inclusion to exclude, and it tends to appeal to a much wider range of voters than would be a kind of an explicitly exclusionary set of claims. And we don't see that in other countries in Europe. In the US, I think it's mixed. I think Trump, one side of his mouth, talks to creedal nationalism, the other side of his mouth, pretty intense ethno-nationalism. And so I think he's less good at covering it up than some of the European leaders, Western European leaders are. And then in Eastern Europe, it's pretty unabashed ethno-nationalism. You know, we see quite a kind of a traditional distinction between ethnic and civic nationalism in the data. And then on Daniel's stuff, so I totally agree with Daniel Ziblatt, and we've written about this at some point together a little bit, that the center right is a guardrail, is a bulwark of protection against authoritarianism in most contemporary democracies. When a center right goes, typically so does democracy, right? That's been Daniel's argument based on his past work on Germany and elsewhere. And then it's sort of incumbent on the more moderate center right representatives, who, as you say, have typically minority of voting support within the party, to kind of stand guard and stand firm against encroachment of authoritarianism. But of course, that rarely happens, or it rarely happens forcefully enough to prevent the co-optation of the center right by the radical right. And so I think the US is a perfect example where it's usually, you know, thoughts and, what is thoughts, condolences, whatever, for poor minority voters, and that's it, right? And nobody stands up. Nobody among the Republicans stands up. Now after this election, because it's pretty straightforward and pretty easy for Romney to do so, he did. 2 or 3 others have, now 5 or 6. But for most part, the Republican Party has just lined up right behind Trump, because he delivered to them what they needed, right? He delivered the presidency and Senate, and he delivered the Supreme Court, and they got what they wanted at the bargain. But the question is, your question is interesting, because it's not just about whether their alliance with Trump is purely instrumental, which it is. Your question is also about their beliefs. Like, are these Republican elites Trumpists deep inside, or are they just opportunists? And that's a really tough question to answer, because, you know, I don't have data on their nationalist beliefs. I can just see what they've been doing over time. And so, you know, people like Lindsey Graham, who used to be an outspoken Trump critic and has completely folded over the past few years and has been the biggest Trump apologist. I mean, is it that he changed his views about what America means, or is it that compromise on him is so severe that he has no choice, or is he just I'm not going to psychoanalyze him, and I don't have the data for it, but it is the case, I think, that the Republican Party, since the Tea Party movement, has become increasingly represents extreme views. And we've seen through DW nominated and other data that on policy issues, the Republicans have drifted far, far right. And I wouldn't be surprised if, of nationalist beliefs, many of the congressional representatives have also drifted to the right. So I think there may be something to that question, that maybe even in terms of their beliefs, they're more aligned with Trumpism than Republicans used to be. I think that's absolutely true. But they're also much more willing to sell out democracy for instrumental reasons than they used to be, right? There are much fewer principled Republicans than they used to be, because they know that minoritarian rule is their only option, right? If the minoritarian bias in American politics was done away with, the Republicans wouldn't be winning elections unless they completely overhauled their campaign discourse, right, and their policies. So I think they realize that, and they basically, the only way for their continued success is to have fewer and fewer people vote. I think that's pretty straightforward, and to continue relying on the Electoral College and the Senate, which are 2 minoritarian institutions.
Thank you, Bart. I had Axel.
Right, thank you. That was a very interesting talk, fascinating. I am wondering whether the fact that your focus and starting point is particular definitions of nationalism, whether what you've captured isn't a surface phenomenon expressing other kinds of emerging cleavages. In other words, well, I'm thinking, for instance, in most cases that I'm aware of, there is a fairly close overlap with the cleavage between urban and rural, which seems to have sharpened over the past several decades. Another one is, you mentioned in passing, which I'm from Holland, so you know, the Geert Wilders phenomenon, just a quick anecdote. I was visiting my mother at the last elections, and here's the party debate. And Wilders stands up and he says, our party has 3 planks. Don't touch pensions, don't touch healthcare, Muslims out.
Right.
It's quite a different rhetoric from what you hear from Trump. And my point is that a very important aspect, at least in some cases, as far as I can tell, is what you mentioned in passing, which is the kind of the unmooring of a considerable proportion of the traditional working class from its traditional social democratic parties. And becoming, and that proportion of the working class vote becoming available to these kinds of exclusivist, nationalist appeals. And so part of what I'm suggesting is that perhaps as a result of other dynamics, the different kinds of nationalisms become expressed or become manifest in this way, where they weren't in the past. Particularly that former working class vote, they would not, in fact, have answered very coherently to nationalist questions, because they were sort of still embedded in a social democratic sort of discourse, right? And once they were loosened out of that, that kind of rhetoric becomes available.
Yep. No, that's terrific. So I'm with you on all of it, except for the starting premise that means that nationalism is epiphenomenal. But I do agree that the urban versus rural divide is hugely important across all of these cases. I mean, you can any of them, right? So Poland, it's about Eastern rural Poland versus urban Western Poland. You have the same thing in the Netherlands. You've got the same thing in the U.S. It just comes up over and over again. Although, and let me say another thing. And then it's also very much true that the white working class in many of these countries is unmoored from its past identities. And that's absolutely the way I think about this as well. In the U.S., it's unmooring from labor identities and labor membership, union membership. In European countries, there's a declining salience of social democratic partisan identities, which is correlated with unions as well. So I think that's absolutely important. The only thing I would say is that let's just take the US, for example. It's not just white working class rural voters. That may be the core, but it's also just white voters. Right? I mean, the bottom line is that whites vote for Trump overwhelmingly, including suburban whites, right? And including suburban whites who are not working class. And in the United States, there is the added complexity that most working class people are not white, right? So most working class people are Black or Latino. And so it's not just the working class politics itself, and Black and Latino voters are also, I mean, the rates of unionization were quite different for Black and Latino workers historically than for whites. So that's part of it too. There is a change in identity among whites that's not paralleled among Latinos and African Americans. But I think I agree with all of that. I think the only amendment I would make, maybe friendly, maybe unfriendly amendments, to say that nationalism had always been there among these people. It's just that it wasn't the salient identity. It was suppressed. It was outweighed by other identities, right? So unions were incredibly powerful in creating the labor identity, the identity we are workers and we matter and we're morally respectable and worthy. So that kept the lid on the nationalist tendencies, and then there were those bloc voting to the democratic parties that followed, and same with social democratic parties in Europe. And as that declines, I think it leaves open the space, exactly as you're arguing, for national identity concerns to emerge. So I think I'm with you entirely. I think these structural shifts have created a new salience for pre-existing beliefs. And coming back to Daniel Ziblatt's work that Andre had mentioned, Ziblatt, Levitsky and Ziblatt make this argument in How Democracies Die, that there's always been 30% authoritarian voters in the United States. They're always there. It's like this reservoir of voters. It's just they're not always activated based on those authoritarian beliefs. And I think I would say something very similar with respect to nationalism. The only reason I would say it's not epiphenomenal is that a lot of the campaigns that activate these voters are campaigns about the meaning of the nation. They're about, it is very, very much the case that what America means to Clinton, what America means to Trump is fundamentally different. And it so happens in these data that I showed you today that it seems that what America means to Republicans in general, what America means to Democrats is increasingly different. And so these are now debates about what America means, which version of collective memory should we care about, and where America ought to go in the future, rather than debates about economic justice or something else, right? And I mean, it kind of gets to the question of what to do with this going forward. There have been some people who've argued, well, Democrats should play the nationalist game and just, you know, come up with an alternative nationalism that they oppose to the Republican nationalism. That's one scenario, although that's dangerous because you're kind of, you're still playing on, you know, the game is still played about nationalism. It's just from different sides. And so that once that kind of can of worm is open, it's really hard to close it. Another way would be to change the topic. Let's stop talking about this stuff and actually talk about what people do care about, other things like economic justice, right? Maybe economic justice, that kind of cuts across race, cuts across various other identity categories, maybe, right? I mean, that's what Sanders tried to do, at least to some degree. So I think, yeah, I appreciate your comments. The thing about Wilders, pensions, healthcare, and Muslims, right? You said it was different than Trump. It was different than Trump's practice, although not that different than Trump's 2016 campaign, where he did talk about, you know, I'm not touching your Social Security. I am not touching your pensions. I'm not touching your welfare benefits. We just need to make those benefits available to the real Americans, not the others, right? And the whole trade deal thing and bringing factories back to the U.S. You know, he talked like an economic populist at times. It's just he never actually governed as one. You know, he campaigned as a populist nationalist. He governed as an ethno-nationalist neoliberal, and yet nobody seems to care about that among his voters. Well, I shouldn't say nobody, not enough, but enough to have him lose the election.
Well, that was friendly amendment in any case.
Okay, sounds good.
I have Alyssa has a question. In the interest of, is there anybody else who has a question? Then. All right, good. Alyssa, go, take it away.
So first of all, I did really enjoy this. It was really fun how complex the theory was and that it wasn't just being narrowed down to just one root cause of everything. But I guess I wanted to dig a little more into the idea of the status threat, because the way you talked about it here, at least, was as a common cause. And I guess I was wondering if, because it comes up in so many different contexts and through so many different processes, I was wondering if it makes sense to think of it as a cause or more as a kind of common psychological mechanism, a button that can be pushed in anyone to trigger certain responses. Because the way you've discussed it, like sometimes it's economic, sometimes it's cultural, sometimes it's more rational, sometimes it's less rational. I mean, in a case I work on a lot in Spain, like you do have this incredibly literal threat to the status of the state coming from Catalonia. It's
right.
Actually, the rise of the Vox can be tied to this, like it's not irrational at all in many ways. There's someone who literally wants to change the state. And versus Brexit, where it's more of this 50-year process of a loss of status. So I was wondering if it seems that there's so much variety in where the status threat comes from, that it might be more of an individual mechanism than a societal one.
Yes. Almost yes. Yes, for most part. So I don't think the status threat is a common cause. I think it's a common mechanism. And I try to frame it that way. Sorry if I wasn't precise here, but yeah, I'm actually, the way I'm trying to frame this theory is that there isn't a single common cause, but there is a single common process and a single common mechanism. Or, you know, sequence of mechanisms maybe. And they are, so far I fully agree. And I think the causes, again, are quite varied. But in all cases, there's a sense that our country is being changed in a way that we don't like, and we need to get it back. And the we tend to be some sort of a majority that perceive itself to be losing status, even if it's not, you know, on paper. Although maybe it is, I mean, it depends, it varies across places. But there's kind of a sense that something is up where we're not recognizing our country as our country anymore and ourselves in it. And, you know, we're not at the center of popular culture. We're not at the center of political debates and so forth. And I'm using we here, you know, the we carries a lot because the we is racialized. It's filled in with religion often. It's filled in with all kinds of other things, rural status, as Axel was saying. So I think I'm with you on that. The place where I would maybe depart a little bit is that I'm not sure it's just a psychological mechanism. I mean, it is that for sure, but it's also a political discursive mechanism. It's kind of a group level mechanism. I mean, sort of the history of this goes back to some of Larry Bobo's work and Herbert Blumer's before that. It is about perceiving yourself as a member of a group vis-a-vis other groups, right? And so I think at some level it does boil down to psychology, but it also exists in broader culture. And so I think that the political elites that are kind of needling this stuff know exactly what they're doing. And they know that this kind of narrative about the loss of an America that we care about and the need to regain it, some mythical America of 1950s or something, when people knew their place, quote unquote, we can get it back if you just elect Trump, or some version of that in the cross-national context. I think is that's drawing on common narratives, political narratives, cultural narratives that then heighten that sense of collective status threat at the individual level. But also that individual status threat, it must be, and I don't have that much direct evidence for this, but it must be amplified through interactions and social network dynamics and media interactions, right? So again, sometimes it's about my experience, quote unquote, right? I'm putting myself in the shoes of a Trumpist, that I have lost my job, or I feel like I can't use the same language I used to publicly that I do around the dinner table or something because of political correctness. So there is this kind of individual level thing, but sometimes it's purely sociotropic, that it's not me actually. I'm doing fine, as many of the suburban white Trumpists are. They're fine, right? But people like them in their broader ethno-racial category are maybe not doing okay, because that's information that's spread through social networks, through media, and is ultimately about group membership and identity, which then translates to these individual psychological mechanisms that you absolutely correctly described. So I think, I would like to. I really want to hang this whole thing on this common mechanism, and the same sets of beliefs and frames that are resonating, but across wildly different contexts for wildly different reasons. And I've been talking about Europe and the US because that's where my expertise lies, but one can go further. So India, right? It's not white majority nationalism, it's Hindu nationalism, right? Or if you think about Brazil, it's a similar kind of neoliberal populist nationalism, Bolsonaro, that you see in the US and elsewhere. You can go to the Philippines, very different there. And so I try not to go beyond what I know, and so those other cases are, if anything, shadow comparisons at best. But I think even there is evidence of similar kinds of processes and mechanisms playing out with very different content.
All right, thank you. I have a whole bunch of questions, but I'll save those for when we get a chance to chat.
Sounds good.
It's getting late and it's Friday. I think I'm supposed to turn it over to Wim very briefly. So first of all, we all thank you for this great talk. Clap, clap.
Thank you.
And Wim has a little something to present. Normally we present this in person, but so now we do it on the screen, obviously.
I'm just trying to show it. It's the cup with the mug. I will email you to ask you for your address where to send it next week.
Thank you. That will be my most prized possession. I can't believe it. I love it. That's just fantastic. Thank you.
This is it's much
I love
nicer
it.
over in a box and people open it, but this will do.
It's beautiful.
We'll
I mean, beautiful in a terrifying way.
And the last word I'll give to our director, Bastien.
Yes, thank you, Thomas, and thank you to our guest for this very interesting talk. I want to invite everyone to our special holiday activity next Friday at the same time, 3 p.m. This week we have to hold something online because we cannot meet. And so our holiday activity will be a round table to celebrate some of our colleagues and even students, former students, who have published some books over the past year. And some of them are related to the issue of nationalism to a certain extent. So we will have a round table about 4 books. One of them is Framing Risky Choices, which is about the Brexit referendum, and some other similar referendums as well, written by Éric Bélanger, Richard Nadeau, and Etche Hoslem Atikin. We will also discuss Lost on Divisions from Jean-François Godbout, who also has a nationalist component. Evan Shore has written a book. I don't have the paper book, I just have a print copy, Aggression in Pornography, with Kimberly Saida, et un livre sur la communication de crise. Véronique Prince, que vous connaissez peut-être, qui est journaliste, qui a fait un mémoire de maîtrise avec Thierry Giasson et qui a publié le résultat de son mémoire de maîtrise. These books will also be discussed by PhD student Esther Harmegnac, postdoctoral researcher David Dumouchel, faculty members Marc Baudet and Elissa Berwick. Et parmi les étudiants qui assisteront, parmi les étudiants du CECD qui assisteront à cette activité, il y a 3 étudiants qui vont gagner des copies de chacun de ces 4 livres. So I invite you to this holiday activity next week. Merci Thomas.
Thank you, and thanks Bart for
thank you all very much.
Talk, and thanks everybody for attending, and have a great weekend.
It was great to see you all. Thanks so much for the invitation. Take care.
Bye-bye.